Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person to unburden the gods.
Hello everyone and welcome. Gosh, we really have to change that song. I have begun working on a new one, so I don't know how long it will take, but I promise that we'll be updating it soon, because it really is rather irrelevant right now. And for those who are watching, you might have noticed, welcome to the first stream with live video. For those who are watching online, I hope everything is okay. There's as usual the traditional technical difficulties, and I have become rather accustomed to only speaking and not noticing where I look or what I'm doing. So I'm going to try and be more conscious of that now that I'm on live video, but bear with me. Yes, there's a link MSP Waves, and you can see everything really over there. Just go to mspwaves.com if you're watching this later as well. All the live shows have are streamed there, audio and video for those. Okay, and in chat, thank you very much for joining. Rondon, as always. This new hacker girl, Alien Honey Gecko, thank you very, very much for being here. It is, as always, a tremendous pleasure to have you here and to be here myself. Yes, beginners. If I suddenly projectile vomit towards the camera, it should grab a few views. But nonetheless, we are here not just for my pretty face, but to get down to serious business. And before I move on, I would like to apologize once again for missing last week's show. It was a lot going on, and I just unfortunately couldn't make it. I was rather disappointed because it was a good one. But luckily, another week has passed in a blink of an eye, and we're here for a brand new episode. And this one, I thought we'd do something a little bit different. I feel like I say that a lot. I'm not sure. Do you feel there's a certain theme and like a direction and style that is consistent, or did you think that every episode you have no idea what to expect? Let me know. But I feel that this one is a little bit different because I'm going to be taking something that Drunvalo mentions in this chapter, and I'm going to be focusing on that and talking a lot about that one specific idea because it is a very large one. And for those who are watching, I'm going to be looking at chat every once in a while and trying to catch everything there. So if I miss anything in chat and etc., you know by now. You know I'm doing my best. I'm only human, and bear with me. I'll make it worth it by the end. Excellent. Oh, I'm glad you feel that way, Rondon. Yes, I'm trying to go for a theme, and this week we're going to be focusing less on getting through the book and getting through the subjects that Drunvalo is talking about, and we're going to be focusing on one specific part, which is... It's interesting. I don't obviously mention everything that Drunvalo says in the book, and some of the things I feel are a bit out there. Not necessarily for me, and I'm sure some people would be able to relate or at least accept to a certain point, but some things might be too far and drive some people away, and there's no reason to get into that because there's a lot of good information. Just to curb your curiosity, things like the fact that the alien beings who arrived on Earth approached the dolphins as the most intelligent species here to ask them for permission to be here. So things like that I usually skip over, unless they are obviously pertinent and rather crucial, but Drunvalo does enjoy the odd example and tale here and there that aren't necessarily absolutely relevant or indeed that important to the narrative. Having said all that, this idea that we're talking about today is rather crucial and has some very far-reaching effects and consequences. And so I wanted to focus on this basic idea. So it was 2 weeks ago, for those who are following, and we'll just go over very quickly the few things that we were dealing with. We mentioned very, very briefly the halls of Amenti as the place where the act of creating humankind took place. Not a physical, geographical place, but in a spiritual realm to a certain degree. And the two beings, the Nephilim in Drunvalo's language, who are the Anunnaki in Sitchin's books, and the Syrians who came from Sirius, and the combination of these two distinct species gave birth to our new species, and really, in Drunvalo's words, the new direction in an evolutionary term. So each species carries with it a certain evolutionary branch, and success or failure or evolve into something else. That's sort of the language that he uses here. Now, I talk about all this because all of that, more or less, I mean, to a certain degree, is coincides with what Sitchin talks about, and indeed Drunvalo, as I said, mentions him in person and his book specifically, saying that it's very important information that he has in there, and that Thoth agrees with nearly everything that Sitchin says, which is a pretty big statement coming from, I think, a competing, as it were, author. But at the same time, Drunvalo then sort of branches off to his own, or Thoth's, version of history, and this is what we're going to focus on today. So before we get into the actual subject of this week's episode, Drunvalo mentions two very famous, I think, ideas, names, and those are the two continents, Lemuria, the lesser known, and Atlantis, the more famous of the two. Now, we're going to be talking about Atlantis quite a bit. In fact, both Drunvalo, Melchizedek, and Gerald Clark talk a lot about Atlantis, and specifically the Atlantean culture, the Atlantean religion at the time, and it's a pretty big subject that takes up a lot. It's sort of like Sitchin's own. It's another world that we sort of will delve into, but not yet. For now, we're just going to mention the very, very basics. And actually, I wanted to say something before I continue, because last week, I will get back to the point, I promise, but last week I found out, sadly, that Gerald Clark passed away in June this year, a few months ago. And so I felt, since I mentioned him a lot and he's impacted me so much, I would share the sad news that I'm actually not too sure of all the details. The only thing that I could find that spoke about it was an Instagram post by his wife. So that actually leaves, I think, the only one of the four researchers still alive today is Michael Tellinger, which is an interesting thought. These great men, and Gerald Clark was indeed, in my mind, a very prolific, great understander and researcher into these subjects, and so we're going to get to him, but I felt the need to at least update and let you know that it happened very recently, and I'd only just found out last week. So we'll be talking about Gerald Clark later, and we'll be talking about Atlantis from his research as well, but for now we're going to focus on Lemuria. And for those who have never heard of Lemuria, which why should you? It's a lesser known continent, and I think in recent years it's gained more acknowledgement, and more people have read about it and heard about it. It's sort of a precursor to Atlantis. So if you can imagine whatever you're imagining about Atlantis being this ancient secret continent with a advanced civilization that was wiped off in some kind of cataclysmic event, then Lemuria was a very, very similar story that happened before. About a few tens of thousands of years before Atlantis came, and as Lemuria sunk, so Atlantis in the same event rose and began that cycle. And so these two continents, although obviously they were different time periods, they were very close, they were very similar, and the linear story is woven through those two continents as a very crucial part in our species history. And so we are going to be talking about a lot of that in there. Thoth, in fact, in his words in the book The Emerald Tablets, claims to be an Atlantean king. And so his perspective, and Drunvalo's from there, is obviously very... it's described as being very intimate, and someone who was actually part of that culture. So we have a lot to look forward to, but for now, we're actually going to focus on something very special that happened there. And that is that, Soundwaves Photon, I have to welcome, so many people have joined, I'm sorry. Crimson Clad, thank you for joining. LP Faust, Revised Sociology, Soundwaves Photon, thank you all so much for being here for the first video episode. So, in that time, we're talking about, let's put this in time period. Following Sitchin's timeline, we spoke of Adam and Eve being created in one of the later sort of specimens, and then they were put in the Garden of Eden with Enlil, and they were working in the fields, and we're not told too much about what happened during that time. We're told even less in the Bible, and then Sitchin talks about what he knows and what he discovered, and so Thoth now brings an extra perspective, as it were, and that during that time there were people who were taken from where they were created in Africa, or according to them on an island next to Africa, and they were put in this new continent, which was Lemuria, and they were allowed to really develop freely and weren't enslaved there, but were actually given the opportunity to advance spiritually. And I'm not going to get into the details of how and what the society was in this part, because we're focusing on a very, very specific event that took place, which was there was a couple, two people there whom, you know what, I actually can't remember the names right now. I will put it in the end of the episode, I hope. But there were two people on Lemuria who managed to achieve something very, very significant. And that was that they had managed to conceive a child without the physical, intimate act. They had sort of an outer body experience on an astral plane. And within that astral plane, the woman conceived and bore a son. And these are Drunvelo's words again, so we'll get into it as we go, but just to put it all out there right from the beginning, in his words, they had realized that what they had done was remarkable. This was the first time that people had done such a thing, and they had actually, they realized later, as people started dying, that they had become immortal. And so this act of, in the astral plane, having this intimate act of the creation of life was something that, automatically not earned you the right, but was a physical reaction, as it were, and the beings, the three entities, the father, the mother, and the son, became immortal. That is the story according to Drunvelo. Now, why would I choose such a tough topic to talk about in a podcast where I specifically try to avoid any of the too crucial, not try to convince anyone of anything? This idea sounds absolutely insane for many, many reasons. I mean, obviously, the idea of people becoming immortal is already rather difficult to swallow. And then for the idea of people visiting willingly the astral plane, being able to decisively do actions and have those actions affect what happens here on Earth to the point of creating a child, all sound about as far-fetched, I think, as can be. And so I wanted to break this down, and that's really the core issue that we're going to be talking about in the episode today, which is, what is this process of creation? And what we're going to be talking about is something which I will term now, we'll give it a term, we'll coin the term that will be our basis. Now, there are many, many different names for it, and we'll go through them, but we need to start from somewhere. And so the force of nature, as it were, that we're talking about today is what we call sexual energy. Now, sexual energy, I'm specifically choosing that term because it has a very specific connotation, because we have a very specific experience with that force. And so the term sexual energy obviously relates specifically to the sexual act in any way, shape or form, and usually the sexual gratification. We don't usually think of the same kind of sort of sexual energy and calling it that if we're talking about, the act of trying to create a life, trying to become pregnant. Then we usually use other terms like conceive. In the Bible, we use to know. We have this sort of separation that's happened between sexuality, especially in our modern times, and creating life and becoming pregnant. I can see a few comments here. Okay, it's all good. So, the reason I wanted to call it that was to draw attention to the fact that this force of nature has many, many, many different names and different ways that we can perceive it. And we're going to go through a few of them now. And so the first and probably easiest one to draw the connection is Tantra. And so the idea of Tantra, for those who don't know, it's a spiritual practice that comes from the East, comes from India. And the idea behind it is to harness the sexual energy and to use the sexual energy in order to achieve enlightenment. And so here immediately, this is, a very different system, obviously very separate from what Drunvalo talks about in Atlantis. And yet there's a very interesting core principle about the relationship and the connection between the sexual energy and enlightenment or immortality, which are seemingly interchangeable to what we can understand here. So the idea of Tantra and the sort of basis behind it within the Indian philosophy and medical system, their system of perceiving the human body, there is a force which they call Kundalini, which we should translate as the sexual energy, the force that we recognize as that sexual energy. But Kundalini is treated very, very differently. First of all, it's a completely spiritual term. And this term, I've spoken about it. We spoke about it last episode, in fact, if you recall. And I'm going to reiterate it very quickly, that it's a force that can be awakened within, that it relates to the chakras being opened and that force being allowed to climb up the spine and sort of bring all of those chakras into alignment and become open. And this experience can often be a very powerful one, and indeed it's used again as a form to attain enlightenment. And so this Kundalini force is really, as described, a force, a natural force within our body that resides in our stomach, and it's described as being sort of coiled up like a snake. And then when it's energized, when it's awakened, then it can spring up through the spine and up through the crown chakra and beyond, etc. So this idea of having this sexual energy being connected to our spiritual path is something that we see very clearly in a lot of Indian spiritual traditions. Now, there are lots of other traditions, in fact, if we think about it, that talk about this in a roundabout way. And I think one of the most famous two, in my mind, are the Judaism and Christianity. Within Judaism and Christianity, there is a very firm belief among the ascetic monks for each, and those who want to abstain from physical sins, as it were, or from sort of contaminating the body more in Judaism. It's described that you must refrain from, at least from, as it says, spilling the seed in vain, so masturbation, but any kind of usage of the sexual energy that is not for the creation of life. And so that's at least in the Jewish tradition. In the Christian tradition, it goes even further to say that there should be no sexual engagement of any kind for, let's say, the priests. Again, some of them I'm doing generalizations, but if you look back throughout history, you can see in these two traditions that there was a strong aversion from awakening and having anything to do with the sexual side of life. And indeed, we can see that due to the Christian and Catholic traditions, our society as a general suffered a great deal of psychological damage that comes from the impedance and disturbing of these natural processes, the sexual force being one of it. So, sorry, I'm just checking through chat. on a rant. Anyway, so I know this is a bit of a touchy subject, and I know that it's easy to fall into all kinds of different perspectives on it, let's say. But I'd like to share with you a perspective that might be a little different than what we are used to about these subjects. And we'll get into other ascetic traditions as well. But there's another form of this energy that we all, I think, have heard of. And in fact, we have a word for it in English, and yet we might not connect it. And that is the term muse, or the muses, who, for those who don't know, in Greek philosophy, or I should say theosophy, as it were, in the Greek tradition, the muses were these not godlike, but beings, non-human entities, who would come and bestow the inspiration for the artistic, creative arts. And it was obviously considered a talent or some kind of benefit to be able to contact these muses, but they were always fickle, and it was nothing you could really rely on. And it was very much considered that the ability to create, and definitely the ability to create the best artists, as it were, came from these muses. However, it seems that when we look at the modern day interpretation of that, what we really are talking about is, again, this same force. And so we're going to see in a minute why that is and how we can see it. But this sexual force, the kundalini, the part in ourselves which is in charge of creating life, is the same energy that is used in creativity, specifically that ability to be creative. And the idea of the muses coming and bestowing their gift upon us is obviously very much in place with the Greek tradition of all of these external forces being some kind of anthropomorphized entities that were coming into contact. But nevertheless, they understood that this force was something very, very different from our internal consciousness. It was something that we couldn't really control to a certain degree. And again, that reminds us a little bit of how we perceive this sexual energy. Now, we're going through these rather quickly, so let me know if at any point we've got something that I need to go over, because I can't see anything specifically sticking out for me. So let me know. Maybe write in, if you've got a question, then tag me in Discord. So, where does that leave us, really? Well, we still don't really know what it is. And obviously, it's one of the most mysterious, sort of famous forces that we come into contact with. It's part of our selves. Obviously, the hormonal changes that we go through have a huge impact on us. And indeed, you can see the evidence of sexual power having a lot of control over many people. And yet, we're not really sure what it is, because ultimately, it's what is responsible for creating all life, not just within humans, but everywhere. And it's what was responsible for creating each one of us. And so it's really difficult to unite these two very, very distinct, very, very polarized opposites, where on the one hand we have this completely, sacrilegious and juvenile and, impulsive, animalistic side of ourselves, and at the same time it's what's responsible for the creativity, the part of ourselves that makes us human, and indeed for creating life as we know it, and possibly even the spiritual side of reaching ascension. So how do we wrap our heads around all of this? And this is really I think we're just about on time, because we're going to be talking about a new person who I don't think I've mentioned yet. But before we get to him, we're going to talk about Freud. Now, I don't mention Freud very much. I honestly haven't studied him a lot. I sort of got a lot of the gist of what he was saying and felt it wasn't quite for me. But his earlier work, I will say, is very interesting. And in it, he discusses a term that we probably have all heard of, another term for that sexual energy, which he called libido. Now, a libido is not entirely just that same force in our language, but it's actually used to think of as more of a life force than a sexual force. And yet, we obviously recognize the two being the same. And for Freud, the libido was what separated something from living and from being dead. It was that part of a body and organism that makes processes continue, or indeed leaves the host, the body, once it's finished and starts the process of decomposition. And so Freud's understanding of the libido is actually, it's interesting because he was sort of on the right track, and if he just carried on in that direction instead of going way off to all the daddy issues that he suffered from, it would have been very interesting to see where that would have left him. But yes, exactly, Soundwaves Photon, I actually only saw that after I said, but yeah, Freud did good dream work, but then abandoned it. And he did some other interesting things. And yes, obviously, when we mention Freud and his shortcomings, we must mention Jung and how he, well, I don't know if you say complemented or simply replaced Freud, but there is a third German psychologist from around the same era who was a contemporary of Jung's, younger, but definitely they were around at the same time. Much lesser known, and I think more important than both. And I don't say that lightly. I have a huge amount of respect for Jung. But as it is, I feel that he might have done more for a lot of things for humanity than even the other two. And so we're going to talk about him. And his name was actually Wilhelm Reich, but we'll call him William for short, or Billy. But William Reich was an amazing character. Has anyone in chat read any of his books? Let me know if you have. He's very well. Actually, today he's much more well known, again, as all these things with time. But even if people have heard his name, it's usually in connection with Organon and all of that work. And not many people have studied his work, his earlier work as well. In fact, the first book of his that I read was called The Function of the Orgasm. And again, in that title already, you know, it's a very hard book to not pick up and start snickering just at the title. And yet it's the most scientific, and it really does study on an evolutionary, biological, and psychological level the function of the orgasm. Organ is real. Oh, nice. Sound waves photon, yes. So it's a very interesting book, and it's what started him on his journey. And indeed, if we're going to be talking about the sexual force, we can't possibly ignore his research. And so I think for those who have never heard of him or know a little bit, it's worth mentioning, just giving a brief outline of who he is. Exactly, he is known, well, he should be known. He's one of the few authors whose books were burned in the United States in the 1980s. I can't remember what year, 83, 84, something like that. But very, very late, post-hippie movement. He became more famous with the hippies. They found his work on sexuality, sexual freedom, and took it to a very different direction. And he was publicly, you know, shamed. And well, we'll get into the end of his life, which was much sadder later. But first, yeah, look it up. By the way, seriously, it's crazy. When I heard that they'd burnt his books, I really couldn't believe it. But he started out in Germany post Freud and Jung, and was faced with an overwhelming population in dire need of psychological help, as I think most people post World War II and post World War I really in Germany were. And he opened a free clinic, and the free clinic was about specifically focused on sexual psychological dysfunction and problems. And that was really his focus and his expertise. And he worked and operated in this clinic for over a decade. I can't remember exactly how long, and he had a few places that he'd worked. And he was well respected for most of that time within his community of peers. And with that, he was doing all of the research that would serve him later. Not specifically intending to. He was obviously treating all of these people, but as he treated more and more people and found these same problems coming up again and again, he started to draw his own conclusions, and he started to focus a lot on the importance of sexuality, sexual freedom, sexual release, and the sexual force on our psychological health specifically. So this isn't physical. This definitely wasn't spiritual. He wasn't, to my knowledge, that much of a spiritual person. All of his texts, all of his writings, everything stems from the science behind it, and he treated it all with the utmost respect for facts, and really stayed very well clear from any kind of hypothesis that he couldn't prove. Having said that, the conclusions that he reached were so outrageous and earth-shattering that he nonetheless was shunned, obviously, and called a fraud and other various things. But in his earlier days, as he was still practicing psychology, he had this growing interest in the role that sexuality plays and sexual hang-ups and how they affect our adult life and health. And so he continued his research, and again he published this book, The Function of the Orgasm, in which he explained a lot of it. But by researching it, he came across something, and this is the purpose of bringing his name up in this episode, which was he discovered a new force. Now, that's a very strange thing to say. It's hard to imagine anyone discovering a new force in 1950. When we use the term force, I mean, people discover chemicals, people definitely discover, new compounds. But a force is something very, very fundamental. And to find a force that has never been shown in scientific studies anywhere in history is really outrageous to begin with. Anyone who's claiming such a thing will need to have a lot of very hard evidence to back it up. The problem was that he had that evidence, and the evidence came in numerous forms. He managed to utilize this force, this energy, to power a light bulb, to affect water molecules, to affect magnetic flow. So he showed empirical evidence of this force, this energy interacting with his environment. And despite all of this, he still was utterly ignored. In the end, the thing that he is probably most famous for today is called orgonite, and that is based on his invention, which was the organ therapy. And so the force that he had discovered, he had a laboratory in Organon, and that's why he named it Organon. And he started working with it, and one of the biggest applications that he found was for healing and for curing different diseases. And so he found that this energy was an important part of human beings' bodies in general and their level of health. He found that it came in much, much larger quantities and concentrations from bodies of water, from water itself. And as he was experimenting with it, he found that there was a different relationship between organic and inorganic materials. And by layering a box with organic and inorganic layers, he managed to sort of concentrate and trap more organ inside than would escape out. And so he would sort of raise the levels in these boxes that were with walls of these layers. And people who had cancer or diseases would go and sit inside this box and would stay there for however long it would be, 20 minutes, an hour. And as they're staying there, this organon would flow through their bodies and would have a very positive healing effect, to the point of showing tumors decreasing, vitality increasing, etc., etc. If you're interested in any of this, I have to mention, please go and look it up. He's got a lot of research today. There are a lot of people who are following up on his research, and it's unbelievable. It really is. I've read a lot of various alternative therapies for cancer, and I think his is really something else. So we'll we won't go any more into the organ therapy, but that is definitely one of the more important applications that he saw. But from that, people have then created these sort of, they look a little bit like crystals. They could be pyramids or different shapes, where again they have these layers of organic and inorganic material, and that concentrates the organon. And these artifacts, these structures, are called orgonite, and that's the more famous term that people know today. And so what he discovered was that, among other things, obviously, this organon was a force in nature. And he wrote a lot of books about the subject, and it's really interesting because this is, again, the description of a new force that hasn't been documented ever in any scientific journal, and yet he is proving its existence with various scientific experiments that are showing that it's working. And the thing about it was that, for him at least, and I believe this is the case, although I'm not entirely sure because I haven't researched it specifically, but he never mentions the organon as being something that was brought up before in any kind of spiritual practices. The only thing that he sort of relates it to in my memory, specifically by name, is the libido, which was Freud's term again. And so he makes the claim that this sexual energy, this sexual force, is this organon, is again this same force of nature that exists not only amongst humans in the creation of life, but indeed throughout the cosmos. And he claims and shows to a certain degree that this force of nature affects Earth in a cosmic level, on a cosmic scale as well. There's a tidal wave of organon energy that's wrapped around, enveloping the Earth, and is actually causing some of its behavior. But never mind that now. We won't get off topic too much. For our intents and purposes, how are we doing for time? Okay. Yes, Reich was a genius. Oh, I'm glad you've heard of him. A lot of people here. Nice. So yes. Soundwaves Photon says his best book was The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and I find myself quoting that book so often. But again, it's not related to Organon, the mass psychology, slightly, but it's more about, indeed, our times, and coronavirus should definitely make it more relevant. Just go and read all of his books. Any of them will do, and you won't regret it as far as I'm concerned. I bought his book in this crazy, weird, second-hand market years ago. Before I really knew him, I think I'd heard of him, but I didn't really know anything, and I was very surprised by this, the title, The Function of the Orgasm, and I just started reading it. It was incredible. And it really did teach me a lot of seeing what the sexual energy really is. What, when we think about it in our day and age and in our daily life, we never really relate. And yet it's interesting that this is probably the most powerful force that we have. Indeed, we talk about women, creating life and growing life in their womb, which is definitely true. And yet that spark of creation that starts it all does come from this very, very mysterious sexual energy, power, force of nature, which we don't understand, and we, to a certain extent, we should say that we do, look very lightly upon it in our daily lives. I think in today's modern society, it's no longer something that is in any way revered or looked upon as, indeed, something that can be a spiritual practice. But it seems that throughout history, that idea has been around in many, many different religions, spiritual practices, groups, etc. And I think it's worth mentioning because this is something that I spoke about with a friend a while ago, and it's, so here we have a certain paradox, sort of a paradox, where on the one hand we're saying, sexual energy is something that can be used for spirituality, and so we shouldn't abuse it. We shouldn't be just using it for other purposes. We should be savoring it because it's something special. And at the same time, Reich has come and said, after having that Christianity, completely demonize sexuality in any way and pushing it as far away from common life as possible, all of these people, the Germans specifically, as Reich found, but all over the world, had grave psychological problems that arose from that. And why is that? How can we explain these two sides, where on the one hand is it something that we need to cherish and not use and save for specifically what it was created for, or is it something that it is natural and important for our health and can cause problems if we are not treating it as a natural part of our life? And so I think the answer lies in exactly which of those two, somewhere in between, as it were. With Christianity, the answer was simply a deny it, repress it, shun, do everything you can to push it away. But if we look at spiritual practices, and I'm going to mention one more because I personally feel more closely to it in Taoism, we have a lot of practices relating to the sexual energy, but there it's not repression. It in fact is conservation and indeed utilization. And so the idea behind it is not that you mustn't masturbate and you mustn't do anything sexual with anyone ever, but that you need to utilize that force within you, conserve it, and use it to gain health. And so what Christianity and a lot of other religions did was they left people with nothing to do with this sexual force inside of them, and yet told them that they mustn't do anything with it. And that's where the real problem starts. If someone is interested in utilizing it as a spiritual practice, then completely abstaining from any sexuality is not the only thing that's necessary and can cause psychological or physical harm. It needs to be done as the utilization and indeed the practice that goes along with it. And that is exactly what we see with Tantra and with a lot of these things. There is a very, very strict, specific practice, diet, physical exercise, meditation, all of these things that have to come along in order for it to not cause any harm and for it to be actually beneficial. So it's important to note the difference between those two. I saw a question a while ago, about Reich. Okay. So we spoke about Reich's discovery. What happened was that after he published and spoke and became more famous with treating cancer patients who came to what he has invented for the Organon therapy, there was an undercover reporter, and she came to the house to experience. I think she wasn't actually undercover, if I'm not mistaken, but she came to the house to write a story about Reich, and she was probably paid by someone. And the piece that she wrote described Reich's laboratory and his experiments as orgies, as complete sexual promiscuity, people completely, going over for no reason. Absolute lies, made the whole thing up, a complete nonsense. I know, media lying, crazy. But obviously that's what stuck. His name got out that he was this sexual, pervasive character that needed to be dealt with. And indeed he was ordered to come to court. He was charged with, misconduct, something ridiculous. And he was served. And he refused to go. He refused to accept the charges. He said, "This is absolutely ridiculous. There's nothing behind them," and he just completely refused to acknowledge it. And so they had the trial without him. He was found guilty, and he was put in prison for the rest of his life. He was 50. I can't remember exactly, but 50-something, 60-something when he went into prison, and he died there quite a few years later. I can't remember exactly the dates, but that was his story. And then, obviously, years and years later, and even then as well, people discovered his work, discovered his research. In fact, his laboratory was burnt down. There was a fire, and the FBI were called in and it's still a bit hazy as to what exactly happened. A little suspicious for those who are so inclined. But all of his research was, not all of it, but a lot of his research was burnt. His laboratory, the equipment, everything that was going there was. He had a lot of researchers there with him as well. He died in prison. So unbelievable. All of these stories of genius is very sad. Anyway, we won't dwell on the past. We will be very, very grateful that we did get so much of his work nonetheless, and that we can study what he said today, because I think it's very, very unique, specifically in scientific realms. And if you are so inclined and have more of a scientific mind and are looking for some of these, subjects, Reich is one of the best places to start. Drunvalo is not as scientific, to say the least, and Reich absolutely was. So, okay, wow, we went off on a huge tangent with him. How are we doing? Okay, nice. We could do a whole show. I could do a whole series just on Reich's work and what he said, and he had a huge influence on me as well. But we'll continue and sort of come back to where we started from, and I think that will be just in time. Freud had a grudge, absolutely. So we see here, if we recall the story that we started from, that after looking at all of these different perspectives on this very, very basic practice, as it were, we can now start to think, what would it mean, to have sex, to conceive a child in an astral plane? This is obviously a physical act. There is very little that we can conceive of, that we can imagine about it being spiritual. And if we imagine the astral plane as being a completely ethereal, non-physical, spiritual plane, it would be hard for us to marry these two ideas. Until we think of the sexual energy not as merely a physical one, but indeed a spiritual one as well. Hang on, do I have a problem with the stream? Is everything okay? Oh, okay. Sorry, if there's anything, let me know. Otherwise, I will carry on. So, how do we understand this? Well, it seems that this force is the force that brings beings into a physical body, and is the force that takes life with it when it leaves. And so, although this is the force that creates physical life, as we can see, and this is the force that we most connect with this material plane, nevertheless, that seems to be not exactly the case. It seems that as we look at the spiritual aspect of it, the spirituality, the ethereal part of life, comes with this sexual force. And so the physical body is merely a physical vessel that needs to contain this life force, this libido within it. So if we try to think of that life force, that libido, as something that is not purely physical, but indeed is the spiritual, ethereal aspect of physical life, then we can see how these two beings, who obviously, when we're talking about the Atlanteans, they're not regular human beings and they're not Neanderthals. They are closer to spirituality, and they're more ethereal, or at least more in touch with their ethereal side. For example, if we imagine that they can have an outer body experience, that they can travel to the astral plane at will, then perhaps we can start imagining that they can harness this life force, this libido, and use it on the astral plane as well. And here again, when Drunvalo talks about this doesn't mean, having sexual intercourse in astral plane, meaning there is no physical contact in that same way. It's not like having a wet dream, okay? It's more of combining these two life forces in order to create a new one. And that, as we can see, it brings us back to a lot of the things that we've spoken about, whether it's the two polar opposites coming together and merging, This seems to be a very, very basic fact. And when we look at the most minute details of conception, of creating life, we see that on a DNA level, this is more or less what's happening. It's not a physical act. It's an exchange of information. It's almost so abstract that it's hard to conceive. But again, this is the ignition. This is the beginning of the spark that then leads to life growing. And indeed, if we compare the two, the actual force, the act of conception can take seconds or less in certain species, but usually the act of growing that life inside takes much, much longer. That's because the act of growing the life is the physical act itself. And so once those two beings had conceived in the astral plane, the mother couldn't become pregnant in the astral plane, because becoming pregnant is the physical aspect of it. That only happens once they had returned to the physical realm. And if we look at these ideas from a very different perspective from what we used to, as I can't remember what film it was, but this idea of like, if you have sex with a ghost, is it cheating? Like, how do we marry this very earthly, material aspect of sex and the spiritual, ethereal side of beings? We can start to see that perhaps it's our mistake of thinking of this sexual act of conception as being such a purely physical, animalistic one, and being much more coming from the spiritual, ethereal side of our lives. Whew, that was a mouthful. Okay, I apologize. I promised myself at the beginning of this episode that I would try and talk more slowly, and I think I failed miserably. The thing is, I'll just tell you now, when I get excited about something, when I'm passionate about what I'm talking about, I talk very fast, and it's a problem, so I'm going to try and work on it more. But when we talk about these subjects, it's just, there's so much that I would like to say. So I hope that was understandable and at least coherent enough for you to follow, even if it wasn't, in terms of the idea, coherent enough for you to follow. Yeah, there's where is it? There's a film. I can't remember what film it is. It's a comedy, and the woman comes into contact with a ghost, and then the question is whether she's allowed. I can't remember actually the details, to be honest, but there was this question, and it's an interesting one to consider, as comparing the physical act with the ethereal act, because again, like, sometimes I think in some people, in their minds, the physical act is actually meaningless, or merely pleasurable, whereas emotionally, as it were, mentally, falling in love with someone or wanting to spend time with them, even if it's platonic, can be considered more of a cheating emotionally than indeed the physical act. I don't need to draw any conclusions about me. I am certainly have a strong aversion to any intimate act that's done, behind the back and without the other. But it raises the question of, where do these things happen? Where do they come from? Within the act of conception, of creating a life, is there some spiritual element to it, or does there have to be, as it were, a spiritual element to it? And in fact, how much time do I have? Okay, if we recall last week, I'm pretty sure it was last week. No, maybe it wasn't. There was a book about a Russian book about Anastasia. I'm not sure have I mentioned it before in the podcast. Anastasia, a book about a Russian woman who lives in a taiga, who is very much living off the land. I'm trying to think if I mentioned her in any of the episodes. It's an interesting book, and I read it alongside Drumvelo, and it was the correlation between the two that was very, very interesting. But in there, she said that when I can't remember how she describes it, but sort of pure conception, when it's truly a conception that's without any physical urges, as it were, impulses, but truly accepted and with the wish to create a life as opposed to having a pleasurable experience, then the actual act itself is done almost without being aware, without being conscious of it. You fall into a sort of state of trance, and that seems to be a description of leaving the physical realm and actually entering into a certain spiritual, ethereal perspective. So if you've read the book, that might help you. If you haven't, that probably won't at all. I can see there's someone. That's okay. I'm not going to read the out in chat. If you want to watch all of what chat is talking about as the show goes on, then please make sure you follow us in Discord. And for those on Discord, don't forget, there is now the option to subscribe to the show you're listening to, as well as subscribing to all the shows. Does that work? But if you want to subscribe, then with just one click, subscribe, and then that should do it for you. I wanted to remember that. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry about the setup here. It seems to have messed up now. I'll fix that later. Yes, apologies to anyone who is watching the video. You have no idea what a janky setup I have here. It's unbelievable. I mean, I've got... Anyway, the light, these are pegs, everything's very unprofessional. Make sure you listen, like, subscribe, upvote, share. And yes, if any of you listening in chat would like to now tell your friends who aren't on Discord and who have never heard of such a thing as a Discord show, but would still like to listen about these subjects, then the podcast is now available on all of the podcast apps that I could think of. And if you think of others, then let me know. So if you'd like to spread the word, help support, and hopefully graduate me to a slightly more professional setup, green screen and otherwise, then that would be very much appreciated. Yeah, we'll see how things go. This was a first try. It's a little bit wonky, but I hope it'll get better from now on. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. Is there anything else in chat that I haven't seen? I can see there's lots of memes. I have to go over them afterwards. Thank you so much for chatting and joining in. Please feel free to, type whatever you want. I just don't always get to read it all during the show, but I do go back afterwards and have a look. So, yeah. Wonderful. Is there a show afterwards, Rondon? And I'd like to thank those who I haven't thanked who've joined while we were here. Ale Indigo. Ale Indigo, thank you for joining. Hive QA, Mariano. You know what? Some of you are here for the show that's next, right? I learned from last time, because some of you I don't recognize. But welcome one and all. Those who are here for my show, those who are here for the next. We are very grateful and happy for you to be here, and hope to provide you with an entertaining experience either side of the hour. And yes, is it next? Post Up, yes. Post Up is up next in 2 minutes. And wonderful show. Please make sure you join. And oh no, of course. I now get the people who are coming early for the next show, and you sometimes catch us on a very off-topic, metaphysical, rather out there conversations. So apologies, it's out of context. You gotta join for the beginning to follow. Actually, joining from the beginning might not allow you to follow either, so I shouldn't promise that, but it'll help. It'll definitely help. A pleasure, Ale Indigo. Is that how you pronounce your name? Ale Indigo? Ale Indigo? I'm not sure, but always a pleasure and lovely to have you here. Okay, so I've been Orlev. Yes, that's the end for our show. It's been wonderful once again, and I hope to see you all next time, next week. Until then, have a good one.